Welcome to Bloor Central, friends. This is Sunday Word for July 10th, 2022. I hope you're enjoying every moment of this wonderful summer. It's going pretty quick, so make sure to enjoy it. Just a couple things I want to remind you about this morning. The big news is that July 23rd, we are planning a picnic up at Jackson's Point. We booked 2 buses that are going to leave 789 Dovercourt at 8:30 in the morning. They'll be returning. They'll leave Jackson's Point, which is where we're going. They'll be leaving Jackson's Point about 4 in the afternoon. So you leave here about 8:30, get back around 5:30, something like that. We're going to be going up. People go up, usually have a bit of a walk, enjoy the camp. Then we have a barbecue lunch together. Then some people go for a swim in the afternoon. It's a really nice day out. It's going to cost $5 for a return trip on the bus, plus for your lunch. So you get transportation and lunch for $5. Want to encourage you, the bus normally fills up. So you'll want to get in touch with Greg as soon as possible. Greg can be reached by dialing the church at 531-8031, 416-531-8031, extension 102, or better yet, meet with him on a Saturday night during the community meal, or on Sunday. Come and see him then, and make sure that you get your money in and book your seat. That 23rd, that means that we will not be here for a community meal. And so the week before, July 16th, I think it is. July 16th is our last Saturday at Bloor Central for the community meal. We are going to be closing for the rest of the summer, reopening on September 10th. When we reopen, we will be reopening as a dine-in community meal. We are concluding the takeaway service. That was really in response to the lockdown of COVID. So we're looking forward in September to sitting down and sharing a meal with you. That's going to be September 10th. For this morning, we're continuing to look at some miracles that are recorded in the Gospels. Over the past few weeks, we've been recognizing that these miracles that Jesus was performing were not just events to be, viewed and looked at. These were events that were actually pointing our lives in a direction. They were signs. This morning, we're looking at another miracle, which has some very important messages in it. And I want to share with you, it's in Luke chapter 5. I'm going to read verse 1 through 11. You can follow along with me. It's in the New International Version, and it says this. One day, as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, the people were crowding around him and listening to the word of God. He saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by the fishermen who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from shore. Then he sat down and taught people from the boat. When he finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and let down your nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets." When they'd done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so full they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, I'm a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. And so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people." So they pulled their boats up on shore, left everything, and followed him. I can remember many years ago when I was in school, hung out with a bunch of guys, and one day one of our buddies decided he was going to try out for the basketball team. And he went out and he made the basketball team, and that was great. And we noticed that, after he made the basketball team, he kind of wasn't hanging out with us much anymore. He was hanging out with the cool guys, you know what I mean? And that was okay. It was no big deal. One thing we did notice, though, that even when we met him in the halls, he seemed to be a little bit awkward even saying hi to us. It seems that our relationship was never the same again. I don't know if you've ever had that where a friend or maybe a family member even had something happen in life and suddenly the relationship's different. It's just not the same anymore. One thing that I find so interesting about the life of Jesus as I read through the Gospels is just how consistent he is. How whether it's a big crowd or an individual, he always seems to be the same guy. He doesn't talk one way to a group of people and a different way to someone else. This passage in Luke chapter 5 is a good example of this, because what I notice is no matter how popular Jesus is getting, he always seems to have time for the individual. He always makes time to speak with someone kind of on an individual basis. You know, and there's many examples of that, particularly the outcasts. But in this one, in Luke chapter 5, even though there's a big crowd that's really interested to hear Jesus, he seems to take time aside to be with Simon Peter. It's a really interesting event that is recorded here. Simon's having a really bad day. He's been fishing all night and hasn't caught a thing. And now he's washing his nets. And you know, it's been a discouraging evening. And in the middle of this busy day, as he's trying to wash his nets, which the fishermen did that apparently. You had to wash your nets, because if you didn't wash your nets, apparently the ropes would harden and crack. So what he was doing was really important. And in the middle of this, you know, important task that he's doing, after a really discouraging and tiring evening of fishing with no results, Jesus hops in his boat. And then Jesus says, you know, I want you to push out, you know. Now, the idea was that there were a lot of people that wanted to hear Jesus, but it was difficult. And I've been to a few beaches like this. I can remember beaches that where the bank of the beach actually becomes fairly steep, and it makes kind of a nice hill for the crowd to sit on. And Jesus sat in the boat a little ways out from shore so that he could talk to many people. So Jesus gets in this boat, and Peter responds by, you know, just taking Jesus out. Now, at the end of the lesson, Jesus says something that seems even a little bit more strange. He finishes talking with the crowds, and he turns to Peter and says, "Put out into deep water and put down your nets for a catch." Now, this is a really strange request for a few reasons. You know, first of all, let me say this. Peter's a fisherman. He knows how to fish. He knows what he's doing. He's made his livelihood doing this. Jesus is a carpenter. You know, it seems odd. Don't you think it seems odd that in a situation like this, the carpenter is telling the fisherman how to fish? You know, it doesn't sound like a reasonable request. Second thing I want to say is Peter has been discouraged. As I say, he's been fishing all night. He's tired. He's got nothing to show for his efforts. And now as he's washing the nets and he's getting them ready so that he can at least go home, Jesus said, no, it's time to turn around. We're going to go back out to the deep water and drop the nets in there. You know, I just don't think it's a good time to be asking Simon to be, you know, going out fishing. It just doesn't seem like a good time for it. Not after he's been, you know, tired all night fishing. The third thing that I think is important to recognize too is that, you know, everybody knew, and I did a bit of reading on this, apparently around the Sea of Galilee, which is where they were, everyone knows the time to fish is like in the early evening or the very early morning. It's at a time when it's a bit cooler and when the fish come into the shallow area. That's where you catch the fish. In the early morning when the sun is low and the fish are in the shallow parts of the water. But here Jesus said, no, you're going to go when the sun is really high in the sky. You're going to go to the deep water. So everything that Jesus seemed to be suggesting here was counterintuitive for Peter. Any self-respecting fisherman would say to this carpenter, look, forget it, man. You don't know what you're talking about. You know, I need to go home and rest. But I want you to consider Simon. Jesus found something in Simon that was very important. And it meant that Jesus really wanted to spend more time with Simon. The more he could see and learn about him, the more he recognized, hey, this is an important guy. The first thing that I'd say about Simon is that he was someone that even when he was discouraged, he did not give up. As I say, he's been out fishing all night. He's caught nothing. He comes home. For me, if I'd been fishing all night, I would have come home and said, hey, get rid of these nets. I'd give them. I'd probably try and sell them, but if I couldn't sell them, I'd probably give them away. I mean, when I get discouraged, that's the way I feel. I feel like just giving up sometimes. I never want to fish again. And yet here is Peter, just notice this, here is Peter that even though he's had a very discouraging evening, he's back washing his nets. Why? Because he's not giving up. He knows he's going to be going fishing again at some point. So in order to do that, he's got to make sure the nets would be prepared. That's really a special quality in someone. Someone who's even in the middle of discouragement and exhaustion is not ready to give up. The second thing that I think is worthy of note of Peter is that Jesus was, recognizing that Peter was someone that would listen to him. He would obey him. Now, if you look in verse 3, it says that in Simon's boat, it says, Jesus got into Simon's boat and said, hey, push out a little. And Simon, who was kind of in the middle of a busy task here, he obeys. He recognizes what Jesus is doing, probably, so he pushes out from the shore a bit, and most likely was actually continuing to wash his nets as he listened to Jesus teach. It's a very simple act of obedience, but it demonstrated to Jesus that Peter was someone who was willing to listen. I want to suggest to you that this qualified Simon as someone that Jesus could work with. If Simon's willing to listen to what Jesus is going to tell him to do, then Jesus knows that this is a guy he can work with. This kind of brings us to the main event. As they close the lesson and the people start to leave, Jesus makes this command, this ridiculous command. Now, you pushed out to the shallow water so I could teach a lesson. Now I want you to push out to the deep water. You trusted me for this. Now I'm asking you to trust me out there in the deep water where you're going to take a catch. Peter responds in a way that is very significant here. He takes time to explain to Jesus why he doesn't like what he had to say. He responds very skeptically. He expresses his frustration. He actually takes time to outline, hey, I've been out there all night, there's nothing there. All of us have been in this position where we've been discouraged, we've been frustrated, we've worked hard, but there's nothing to show for it. We've been frustrated or discouraged. We've been hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. We've been there and we just don't want to have to listen to the Lord anymore. We don't want to be asked to do something that seems pointless to us. And that's really what Peter was dealing with. It seemed pointless to be going back out there when he'd been fishing all night. He was a very competent fisherman. And yet he found nothing. And so to go back now, in the heat of day, in the deep water, it just seemed pointless. And Peter took the trouble to explain that to the Lord. But Simon, I go back and forth. His name is Simon Peter. I sometimes refer to him as Simon, sometimes Peter. Sorry to cause that confusion. But Peter makes an extremely significant statement in verse 5. He says, but because you say so, I will let down my nets. Peter is going to obey again. He's going to let down his nets, not because it made sense to him, not because he understood it, not because he felt like it. There was only one reason why he was going to take his nets out. It was because Jesus had told him to. Sometimes there's hundreds of reasons why we don't want to obey what the Lord has commanded us to do. When in actual fact, there's only one reason to obey. It's because he said so. In this event, we recognize again that when we are willing to obey to the Lord, it makes room in our lives for the Lord to do something miraculous, to do something so very special. If Jesus had hopped in the boat and asked to go push out a bit from shore, if Peter had just said, well, no, I'm kind of busy now, I want to go home, that would have cut off his opportunity to see the miraculous. He could have actually dismissed Jesus when Jesus further told him to go to the deep water. But again, Peter shows a willingness to listen. And again, the way he explained it is perfect. He didn't do it because it made sense. There was only one reason he did. He did it because that's where the Lord told him to go. When we live in obedience, it gives the Lord access to our lives. It is a tangible expression that we're saying to the Lord, Lord, you're in charge, not me. And that is where God really becomes alive in our lives. It makes room for him to work in our lives. As I say, now, I've spoken of obedience a lot over the past number of weeks, and I do have to touch on it again here, but I don't want to dwell on it. I'm gonna speak about it again in further weeks. It's so important for us to recognize, to be walking in obedience to at least what we know and doing the best we can. I know we fail, and we can ask for forgiveness for that. But if we're seeking this miraculous in our lives, then we have to be willing to allow room in our lives for God to come in and do these things. This example with Peter is a perfect example of how it was so essential for Peter to obey if he was ever going to see the miraculous. There's two other quick points, though, that I just want to make before we conclude for this morning, and then I'm hoping this will give you enough to reflect on. I've got two last points. I don't know how many points I've made so far, but anyways, the first of the last 2 points I want to suggest is take note about the response to Simon's obedience. There is so many fish that Simon literally can't do it. So what does he do? He calls his buddies to come over. And what happens is then his friends come over and they participate in the miracle as well. They're blessed because of what Jesus is doing through Peter. This is a perfect example, of how important it is for us as a church, for each one of us to be living in obedience. And as God does something special in my life, there is an overflow that goes to you. And I'm desperate for you to be obedient to God so that God can be doing the miraculous in your life. Because you know what happens then? When God does it for you, then it spills over and it blesses all of us in the church. That's why we come together. That's one of the reasons why we come together as a church. Because as God is blessing us, there's an overflow. We're all blessed when one of us is blessed. If God does a miracle in your life, I don't sit back and say, well, why didn't God do something like that in my life? No, that's not the way it works. When God does something miraculous in your life, I enjoy the spin-off. I enjoy the blessing that comes into my life through that. And vice versa. I think this is a wonderful picture of why God has called us to live in community. When we live in community, the blessing that we receive is shared with others. And I want to continue to encourage you to be doing this. We seek the miracles in life. We seek God's blessing not for ourselves or not simply for ourselves. We certainly enjoy blessing, but when we're blessed, we can be a blessing to the rest of the church as well. And so that's one more thing that I think is really extremely interesting about this miracle. And the last point I want to make, and perhaps this is the most important for some of you, we recognize now as we read through the New Testament that God had a huge plan for Peter's life. Peter was one of the men who changed the course of human history. He started as a fisherman, and yet you look at the powerful ways in which God used, and it all started with, push out a little. That it wasn't a big deal. It was just a small act of obedience. And then it progressed from that. Okay, we're going to the deep water now. And now as Jesus takes him to the deep water and we see this miraculous catch of fish, that is not the end of the story. In actual fact, that's just a sign. Jesus is pointing Peter to the fact that, hey, I can do miraculous things with your life when you're willing to listen to me. And we see that, in fact, Jesus had a lot more in store for Peter than just be fishing for fish. He said, no, you're going to fish for humans now. You're going to make a difference in history. You're going to change thousands and thousands and millions of lives are going to be changed because of your testimony. But in order for Simon to recognize what Jesus had for him, he had to walk away from what he was doing. He had to walk away from his life as a fisherman. That last verse says that they pulled the boats up and they left everything behind them. Following Jesus required something that would leave their old life behind in order that they may understand the life that Jesus was calling them to. The fish in the boat were just a sign that Jesus could do something special through their lives. When a life is going to follow in the steps of Jesus, it's not just about following Jesus, it's about leaving something behind. And for these disciples, it meant leaving their livelihood behind, their occupation, many of their friends. I don't know what it means for you and I to leave behind. Specifically for you, I have ideas in my life of what it means to me, but what does it mean for you to leave your life behind? If you really want to know the plan that the Lord has for you, it starts with these tiny steps of obedience, and that recognizing that as we grow and as we get more and more responsibility, there comes a point where we have to leave our old life behind. Maybe our occupation, maybe, I don't know, maybe not, but there is something that needs to be left behind. The way that we live our life needs to be left behind. As we allow ourselves to walk in the steps of Jesus, suddenly our decisions, our behavior, all of our the way we live is now guided by Him. The disciples had no idea what they were getting into. They had no idea what they were getting into when they entered into this new life. And yet, 2,000 years later, here we are because of what the disciples did. The disciples recognized what it is to follow Jesus, and they passed it on from generation to generation. And now, thousands of years later, here we are, enjoying the benefit of how they taught those early churches to follow Jesus. I want to encourage you this morning to be reflecting on, what are those steps of obedience that our Lord might be speaking to you about this morning? Maybe you're very young in your faith, and the Lord simply saying, hey, I just want you to push out a little ways in the water. No big deal. I just want to see that you're going to listen to me. Maybe it's going to be something more risky, like going out to the deep water and putting down your nets. Maybe it's time to leave your old life completely. I don't really know where you are, but I encourage you this morning to consider this event for Simon and to recognize how you might be fitting into this event. We live in a huge city, and the world is moving faster now than it ever has in history. It's mind-boggling sometimes. It's easy to feel overwhelmed. And I recognize that God is doing magnificent things in our world. I see beautiful things happening. And there can be a sense in which we're kind of being left behind in this. It's just so big. And God is so big. And maybe God's busy running this big world. He hasn't got time for me. I want to remind you, you are not alone. The Lord does not leave you alone. By His Holy Spirit, His presence is promised with us in these moments. And I want to encourage you to just be aware of that. As the Lord stopped, as He dismissed the crowd to speak with Simon, He stops for you right now. He longs for you to draw close to Him. He wants to show you how to live well, to experience the miraculous in your life. And I want to encourage you in these moments to consider how Jesus spoke with Simon in Luke 5. And consider, is the Lord calling you into deeper water?